This week I've been a bit down, even more so than last week. You see, last week many of us were running on adrenaline. We were forced to make quick decisions because we kept getting new advice. Last week, I reckon most of us were either in a state of shock as we were processing the full magnitude of what was happening in the world, or perhaps we were in a state of denial because we just couldn't believe it was true. And some of us will still be feeling that way this week. But others of us might be feeling a little different. Some of us might be starting to be angry or frustrated. Some of us will be feeling hopeless or even depressed. But all of us will be looking for connections with loved ones, with our community and with God. And connection is the one thing that seems to be hardest of all, especially now, especially in this time of grief. It may seem odd to talk about grief at a time like this. Most of us tend to associate grief with loss, usually around the death of a loved one. But grief is something that will always come when we lose something significant to us. And what could be more significant than losing our lives while we're still living? And what I mean by that is, many of us over the last week have realized that for the foreseeable future, the things that we would usually do are not going to get done. And the people that we regularly see are not going to be seen. And though we will do our best to use our phones and computers and whatever else we have to stay connected, the reality is that many of us have lost our lives as we have understood them, at least for a while. And that brings grief. And if the pandemic gets worse here in Australia, that grief will only intensify if we lose our loved ones. And when we grieve, we experience all sorts of emotions: sadness, anger, hopelessness, fear, denial, and shock. The reading for today is from that weird place in Ezekiel which talks about dry bones coming back to life. And it's a story that fascinates all those who have watched too many zombie films when they were younger, or perhaps still today. To our modern sensibilities, it's a strange reading, a macabre reading, full of ideas and imagery that doesn't gel with our understanding of how things should work, how things do work. But if I could assure you something today, it is that scholars are clear that the writing in Ezekiel was written from a place of deep grief, from a place where the writer of Ezekiel and the people he was writing to felt like there was no hope, for they recognized that they were indeed like the dry bones, bleached by the sun in the valley of death. For their kingdom is no more. They have no identity. All that they thought they were, all they believed that they were, seems no longer to be true. And while they were still alive, in a sense, they felt like they were dead. And I'm sure that they grieved in all the ways that we do. But now, they simply feel hopeless. Well, almost hopeless. Nearly hopeless. For the people still have prophets. And in this case, Ezekiel, a prophet, who tells a different story and reminds the people that no hopelessness is final. For God never leaves us. God never leaves us. You see, the prophetic response to the people in this dire situation is to trust in a vision of new life and new hope. And that is the response of people of faith today. That should be our response. To trust in a vision of new life and hope, even when things seem hopeless. That God is with us, and that God has the power to save. And despite the fact that things are indeed objectively bad, and will get objectively worse, as people of faith, we can never give way completely to hopelessness. And so we will keep working for new life and new relationships, because we know our identity is not built upon the stuff of this world, but instead upon the hope of the crucified and risen Christ. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that we're not affected by what's going in the world. Of course we are. We know as human beings we need routine and relationship and family and connection, and all these things have been interrupted. But in the final analysis, at the core of our being, we are not dependent on these things for who we are and our sense of self-worth in the world. For we are absolutely and ultimately children of God. And that good news is to be remembered and proclaimed at times like this. Now, alongside the general prophetic hope of Ezekiel, there are also some hints, so some sort of practical things to focus on in the reading from Ezekiel today. Some things that might help us get in tune with the work of God in the world and perhaps in our lives. And the key aspect that I'd like us to focus on today is breath. Breath. For Ezekiel and for us, it is the breath of God which brings life. It brings life in the vision in Ezekiel. It is the breath of God that inspires the prophetic imagination, that brings life back to the people. And perhaps it is the breath of God which might bring life into our lives once more. Because where there is breath, there is hope. And where there is hope, there is action and new possibility. Tomorrow need not be the same as today. There is something wonderful about the way that breath functions in the ancient worldview of the Hebrews. Because breath means spirit, and spirit means wind, and wind means breath. These things are not separate. They're not pushed into different realms of understanding. Wherever there is breath, there is life. And wherever there is life, there is motion and movement. There is wind, in a sense. And whenever there is life and wind and action, there is spirit. For life is impossible without spirit. All these things are intertwined and inseparable. When I hear today about mindfulness and perhaps other contemporary approaches to dealing with stress and grief that you might find in wellness groups or through psychology, I find it interesting because there's often a focus on breathing. And I think that shouldn't be as surprising as sometimes it is, because even though some of our modern wellness gurus don't know it, as Christians and as people of faith, we know that when we breathe deeply and when we focus on the physicality of life, we start to get in touch with the spiritual stuff as well. When we attend to our breath, our life and our spirit, we are opening ourselves, in a sense, to the awareness that all life, all breath, and good spirits come from God. And just as God breathed life into the dry bones, and just as God acted in deep and mysterious ways to bring hope on Easter morning, God will bring us hope today and every day to come. And so I invite you as a congregation to remember all of this intellectually in your minds, of course, but allow it to go deeper, perhaps during this week and in the weeks to come. Maybe you can engage in some of the breathing practices that I spoke about in my introductory video as part of your prayer and devotional life. For while we are settling ourselves and focusing on life and breath, it is possible, just possible, that we will be quiet enough to hear the voice, to feel the breath of God calling our dry bones to come alive once more. And as we come alive, there is nothing in the world that can drive out the hope for good. Amen.